Ethan Fairchild, a man known for his meticulous nature, has spent years building a reputation as one of the most respected architects in the city. His attention to detail extends beyond the structures he designs, it permeates every aspect of his life. Ethan lives by a strict code of order and control, ensuring that nothing, neither in his professional life nor his personal world, is left to chance. For Ethan, control isn't just a preference, it's a necessity. He has a quiet but powerful presence. Tall, with a sharp jawline and deep-set eyes, Ethan embodies precision in every movement, every word. His colleagues admire his leadership and discipline, though some might say he can come off as distant, even cold. In his personal life, Ethan shares his home with Sophie, his wife of 7 years. On the surface, they appear to be the perfect couple, well-off, successful, and living in an elegant home Ethan designed himself. However, behind closed doors, a growing distance has developed between them. Sophie, once warm and vivacious, has grown increasingly reserved over the past few months. Ethan has noticed the subtle shifts, the late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, the look in her eyes when he asks her about her day. Sophie had always been a free spirit, someone who thrived on social connections and adventure, balancing out Ethan's methodical nature. But now, her spontaneity feels forced, her warmth only a shadow of what it once was. Ethan, though not one to jump to conclusions, cannot shake the feeling that something has changed in their relationship. He's noticed how her phone is now always within reach, how she steps outside to take calls, and how her excuses for late evenings out have become vague and repetitive. Deep down, Ethan suspects there's another man. His intuition, finely tuned from years of paying attention to the smallest details, has been screaming at him to confront Sophie. Yet, he holds back. He watches. He waits. He observes, choosing to remain calm rather than let his suspicions control him. Every time Sophie leaves the house late at night, Ethan feels a knot tighten in his stomach. Her vague explanations, just a work thing, Ethan, or meeting an old friend, no longer ease his growing concern. He senses that these excuses are crafted to deflect his questions rather than reassure him. Still, Ethan knows better than to confront her without proof. For now, his suspicion is held in check, though barely. Setting the suspicion. The turning point comes on a crisp October evening. Ethan had been working late in his home office, reviewing designs for a new urban development project. He had been so engrossed in his work that he hadn't realized Sophie had slipped upstairs, her phone glued to her hand. Only when he hears her voice, low and hurried, does his attention snap away from the blueprint spread across his desk. Ethan quietly makes his way to the bottom of the staircase, careful not to draw attention to himself. Sophie's voice drifts down to him, casual but guarded. She's talking to someone named Daniel, arranging to meet him the next day. Ethan's breath catches in his throat. His suspicion, the one he had tried so hard to rationalize away, hardens into certainty. There is another man, and his name is Daniel. The calm Ethan has prided himself on maintaining feels as though it's slipping. He clenches his jaw, listening to Sophie laugh softly at something Daniel says. He can't make out the details of the conversation, but it's enough to fuel the growing sense of betrayal surging inside him. She's been lying to him, and now, he knows the truth. Sophie comes down the stairs a few minutes later, unaware that Ethan has been listening. She barely glances at him as she heads toward the front door, her coat in hand. "I'm going out for a bit," she says, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. Ethan steps forward, blocking her path. His voice is calm, but there's an unmistakable edge to it. "Who's Daniel?" Sophie freezes, her expression flickering with surprise before quickly turning to annoyance. "He's just a friend, Ethan," she says, brushing past him. "I told you, I'm going out." "With Daniel?" Ethan's voice is steady, but there's an underlying challenge in his tone. His gaze doesn't waver from hers, even as she tries to dismiss him with a wave of her hand. "It's none of your business," Sophie snaps, her tone growing colder. "You don't own me, Ethan." The words hang between them, heavy and sharp. Ethan's jaw tightens. He had always been in control of everything in his life, his work, his home, his relationships. But now, that control feels fragile, slipping through his fingers like sand. "If you walk out of that door with him," Ethan says, his voice low but firm, "don't bother coming back." Sophie pauses, her eyes flashing with anger, but she doesn't say another word. Without a backward glance, she opens the door and walks out into the night. Ethan stands in the doorway for a moment, watching as she steps into a car waiting at the curb. His heart pounds in his chest, but he forces himself to remain still, his expression unreadable. As the car drives away, the weight of what just happened begins to sink in. Ethan feels a sense of loss, but it's quickly overshadowed by something else, something darker. Betrayal, yes, but also a cold, simmering anger. He isn't just hurt by Sophie's infidelity, he's enraged by the deception, the lies she had woven around him, the life they had shared now tainted by dishonesty. Ethan walks back into the house, his mind already turning. He knows there's more to this than just an affair. Sophie had been secretive about money recently, too. Ethan, methodical and precise as ever, decides he won't confront her immediately. He'll gather his evidence first, just as he would when investigating a faulty design. Only when he has the full picture will he act. And when he does, it will be on his terms. Ethan Fairchild, an accomplished architect in his early 40s, was someone who thrived on precision. Every line in his designs, every curve in his blueprints, reflected his meticulous nature. His methodical approach extended far beyond his professional life, it seeped into every part of his being. From the clothes he chose to wear to the way he organized his morning routine, Ethan took pride in his ability to control the world around him. In his mind, this was the secret to his success, mastery over his environment. Chaos and uncertainty were foreign concepts to him, ones he would never willingly tolerate. Ethan's career had soared over the years. He had earned the respect of colleagues and competitors alike with his ability to design buildings that were not only functional but also aesthetically captivating. His knack for blending form with purpose made him a sought-after name in the world of architecture. People admired how he could take something as rigid as steel and concrete and turn it into something beautiful, all while adhering to a strict sense of structure and order. At home, his personal life mirrored this desire for control. He shared his carefully designed house with Sophie, his wife of 7 years. Sophie was once the spark in his well-regulated existence, a counterbalance to his more rigid tendencies. When they first met, Ethan had been drawn to her spontaneity, her infectious laughter, and the way she could bring life into even the most mundane of moments. It was Sophie who had coaxed him out of his tightly scheduled days, who had shown him that there was joy to be found in unpredictability. But over time, something had shifted. The vibrant energy that Sophie once carried seemed to have dimmed. She had grown distant, emotionally detached, and Ethan couldn't quite pinpoint when it had started. At first, he'd told himself it was just the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship, that the initial excitement inevitably fades. But it was more than that. There were signs, subtle at first, but they became harder to ignore as the months passed. It began with the small things. Sophie was more evasive, less forthcoming about her day-to-day activities. She had always been open with him, sharing the details of her social life, her job, and her thoughts. Now, conversations felt superficial, as if she was holding back. Ethan, who usually dismissed such things as irrational, began to notice patterns that unsettled him. Her phone, which she used to leave casually on the kitchen counter, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. She had started taking calls in another room, her voice low, the conversations brief. When Ethan asked, Sophie brushed it off as work stuff or just catching up with a friend. These moments of suspicion gnawed at Ethan, a quiet but persistent discomfort that he couldn't shake. He told himself that it was nothing, that Sophie was simply going through something personal, a phase that would pass. After all, he was a logical man, he refused to act on feelings that weren't supported by concrete evidence. Yet, in the back of his mind, the thought remained, Sophie was hiding something from him. The changes in her behavior weren't limited to her phone habits. Sophie had also started going out more frequently, without much explanation. She would tell Ethan she was meeting friends, attending some social gathering or another, but she never offered details. These outings grew more frequent, and her return home later and later. There was an air of secrecy around her, and though she still smiled at him, it was as though a wall had been built between them, one that he couldn't quite break through. Despite these growing suspicions, Ethan chose not to confront her. He wasn't the type to accuse without proof, and part of him still wanted to believe that he was reading too much into things. Maybe Sophie was just trying to reclaim some of her independence, or perhaps she was going through something she didn't know how to talk about. Ethan convinced himself that time would provide answers, that his calm observation would eventually reveal the truth. However, the tension between them continued to mount. Every night Sophie came home later than expected. Every whispered phone call that ended abruptly when he entered the room added weight to Ethan's growing sense of unease. The gap between them widened, and Ethan found himself watching her more closely, his sharp eye for detail now trained on his wife instead of his architectural projects. The breaking point came one evening. Ethan had been working late, as usual, poring over blueprints in his home office. He was absorbed in the intricate details of a new project when he heard the faint sound of Sophie's voice coming from upstairs. It wasn't unusual for her to make phone calls late at night, but something about this call caught his attention. Her tone was different, lower, more intimate. Ethan's hand froze over the blueprints, his ears straining to catch snippets of the conversation. He made his way quietly to the base of the stairs, positioning himself just out of sight but close enough to hear. Sophie was speaking to someone named Daniel, and they were arranging to meet the following day. Ethan's heart sank as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just about Sophie being distant or needing space. There was another man. In that moment, Ethan felt a wave of emotions: betrayal, anger, confusion. But most of all, he felt a deep sense of loss. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had built a life with, was slipping away from him, and now he understood why. Sophie was seeing someone else. The suspicion that had been simmering beneath the surface finally crystallized into certainty. When Sophie came downstairs, she acted as though nothing was wrong. She casually announced that she was going out, not even glancing at him as she pulled on her coat. Ethan's mind raced, trying to process the conversation he had overheard. He couldn't let her leave without confronting her. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. Who's Daniel? He asked, his voice calm but laced with accusation. Sophie stopped, her back stiffening slightly, but she didn't turn around. For a moment, the room was filled with silence, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, she turned to face him, her expression guarded. "He's just a friend," she said, her tone dismissive. "I told you, I'm going out." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "With him?" Sophie's face hardened, the warmth that once characterized her now replaced with something colder, more distant. "It's none of your business, Ethan. You don't own me." The words stung, cutting through the fragile threads that still held their marriage together. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had always been in control, always able to steer his life in the direction he wanted. But now, that control was slipping, and he didn't know how to stop it. "If you walk out that door with him," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with finality, "don't bother coming back." Sophie met his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her face. Then, without a word, she opened the door and stepped outside. Ethan stood in the doorway for several long minutes after Sophie left. His mind raced, a mix of anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief swirling inside him. The cold night air blew into the house, but Ethan barely felt it. The woman he had shared his life with for 7 years had just walked out the door, straight into the arms of another man, Daniel. He closed the door, his movements slow and deliberate, the tension in his body barely contained. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the closed door, wondering how things had come to this. Sophie had changed so gradually that he had missed the signs, or worse, had ignored them, unwilling to accept the reality that was now staring him in the face. She was involved with someone else, and it wasn't just an emotional affair. Something deeper was going on, something involving money. He had to know the full extent of it. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the living room, where Sophie's phone lay forgotten on the coffee table. She had been in such a hurry to leave that she had left it behind, a mistake Ethan knew she wouldn't have made under normal circumstances. His heart pounded as he walked toward it, the phone now a gateway to the truth he so desperately needed. Sitting down, Ethan picked up the phone, his hands surprisingly steady. He wasn't the type to invade someone's privacy, but this was different. This wasn't about curiosity or paranoia, this was about uncovering the truth that Sophie had hidden from him for months. Unlocking the phone was easy, he knew her password, a detail that now seemed almost laughable. The trust he had placed in her, the life they had built, felt like a cruel joke in that moment. He scrolled through her messages, looking for any sign of Daniel. It didn't take long. Their conversations were threaded throughout her inbox, hidden in plain sight, each one a dagger to his heart. The messages weren't just casual exchanges, they revealed a deep emotional connection between Sophie and this man, one that had clearly been developing for some time. But what shocked Ethan more than the affair itself was the financial trail. As he continued scrolling, he found evidence that Sophie had been transferring large sums of money to Daniel. There were references to his business, cryptic messages about investment opportunities and cash flow issues. Sophie, his wife, had been funneling their money into Daniel's failing business, helping to prop up a man Ethan had never even met. The depth of the betrayal hit Ethan like a freight train. It wasn't just about infidelity, it was about manipulation, about using their shared assets to support another man behind his back. Ethan's world tilted as the reality of it all set in. His hands trembled now as he pieced together the full picture. Sophie wasn't just involved with Daniel romantically, she was financially entangled with him, siphoning off their money to fund his business. Ethan's stomach churned with disgust. His meticulous, orderly life had been unraveled by the one person he had trusted more than anyone else. And she had done it so quietly, so easily. Instead of confronting her immediately, Ethan did what he always did, he controlled the situation. He wouldn't let his anger rule him. He wouldn't scream or accuse. No, he needed to understand everything first, to gather all the facts. Only then would he act. And when he did, it would be decisive, just like every other move he had made in his life. Sophie thought she could deceive him, but Ethan wasn't a man to be outplayed. The first step was to find out more about Daniel. He needed to know who this man was, what kind of business he ran, and how deep his financial troubles went. Ethan's mind clicked into gear, his anger now fueling a focused determination. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for any information he could find on Daniel. It didn't take long to uncover the basics: a small, struggling company, some online records of recent transactions, and a few articles that hinted at past financial difficulties. As Ethan delved deeper into Daniel's business, the cracks in the man's facade became more apparent. It was clear that Daniel's company had been on the verge of collapse for some time. There were rumors of fraud, of deals gone bad, and of shady financial practices that had driven his company to the brink. Ethan wasn't surprised. Men like Daniel, who relied on deception and manipulation, were doomed to fail eventually. But Sophie had been caught in his web, willingly or not, and that infuriated Ethan even more. In the days that followed, Ethan methodically gathered every piece of evidence he could find. He scoured Daniel's business dealings, tracked down financial records, and quietly started contacting some of Daniel's clients and associates. The more he dug, the more he realized just how precarious Daniel's position was. Ethan's anger had now crystallized into a plan. He would destroy Daniel, not through confrontation or violence, but through the same methodical approach that had made him so successful in his own career. Ethan began leaking information to key individuals in Daniel's network, clients, investors, and business partners. He shared just enough to cast doubt, to plant the seeds of uncertainty. It didn't take much. Daniel's reputation had already been teetering on the edge, and with Ethan's intervention, it started to crumble rapidly. Clients began pulling out of deals, investors grew wary, And soon, Daniel's business was spiraling into chaos. Sophie, oblivious to Ethan's machinations, continued seeing Daniel, unaware that the man she had placed her trust in was now losing everything. Ethan took no pleasure in watching her deceive herself, but he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the ground beneath Daniel was collapsing. As Daniel's business suffered, Ethan also took control of their finances at home, cutting off the funds that Sophie had been using to support him. He moved their assets into accounts she couldn't access, leaving her without the means to continue her secret financial support. Sophie started to notice the changes slowly. At first, it was small things, bounced payments, a sudden lack of available funds. She became more irritable, more anxious, but Ethan remained calm, never letting on that he knew the full extent of her betrayal. He watched as she tried to navigate the situation, wondering when she would realize that the man she had been supporting was on the verge of ruin. In the final days before everything came crashing down, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. He had always prided himself on being in control, and now, he was more in control than ever. He had dismantled Daniel's business piece by piece, without ever having to confront him directly. Sophie, too, was slowly unraveling, her carefully constructed lies collapsing under the weight of her choices. And yet, despite it all, Ethan felt no sense of victory. There was only a cold, empty silence in the house, a void where their marriage had once been. Sophie had no idea that the life she had built with Daniel was on the verge of collapse. Ethan had ensured that she would be left with nothing, just as she had left him with nothing but betrayal. But as the final pieces of his plan fell into place, Ethan couldn't shake the hollow feeling that settled deep within him. He had won, yes, but at what cost? Ethan sat alone in the quiet of his home, the dim light of the evening casting long shadows across the room. His hands rested on the dining table, still and calm, as he stared blankly ahead. The house had never felt so silent, so empty, as it did now. The weight of the past few weeks had settled heavily on him, but not in the way he had expected. He had spent days and nights carefully executing his plan, ensuring that Daniel's world was collapsing without him ever knowing who was behind it. And Sophie, well, she would soon realize just how much she had lost. The phone on the table buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at it, recognizing Sophie's name on the screen. She hadn't been home for days now, staying with Daniel as they tried to piece together why everything around them was falling apart. Ethan had anticipated this moment. Sophie would come to him, eventually, thinking she could still salvage something from the wreckage. She didn't know how far he had gone, how deeply he had unraveled their lives behind her back. He let the phone ring a few more times before finally answering. "Ethan?" Sophie's voice came through, laced with frustration and fear. "We need to talk." Ethan took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "What is there to talk about, Sophie?" There was a pause on the other end, and Ethan could almost picture her, struggling to find the right words, to maintain some semblance of control in a situation that had already slipped far beyond her grasp. I need to come by the house. We need to sort things out." "Do we?" Ethan replied evenly, though the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. "What exactly are you hoping to sort out?" "I know things haven't been right between us, but I think we can come to an agreement. I'm filing for divorce, Ethan." There it was. The moment he had been waiting for. Sophie believed she was still the one in control, still dictating the terms. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, a cold smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. She thought she could leave him and walk away with Daniel, start a new life as if he hadn't been part of hers for the past 7 years. But she had no idea what was coming. "Come by, Sophie," he said softly. "We'll talk." An hour later, Sophie arrived at the house. Ethan watched as she stepped out of the car, her face tight with worry, but still holding on to that cold defiance she had displayed the night she walked out on him. As she walked up the driveway, she paused for a moment before opening the door, her steps hesitant, as if some part of her knew that this conversation would be different. Ethan was waiting for her in the living room, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets. He didn't turn to face her as she entered. "You're back," he said quietly. I told you, we need to talk, Sophie said, her voice sharper now, like someone trying to regain control. This isn't working anymore, Ethan. I think we both know that. Ethan finally turned to look at her, his gaze cold and unreadable. You're right. It isn't working. Not anymore. Sophie's expression faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected him to agree so easily. So, I'll file for the divorce. We can split everything fairly. I'm sure Daniel and I will be fine on our own. At the mention of Daniel's name, Ethan's jaw clenched slightly. She was still clinging to the idea that her new life with Daniel was intact, that they could just move on without consequences. It was time for her to face the truth. Daniel, Ethan repeated, his voice low. Let's talk about him. Sophie's eyes narrowed. What about him? Ethan walked toward her slowly, stopping just a few feet away. His expression remained calm, almost too calm, as he spoke. I know everything, Sophie. The affair. The money. The business. Everything. The blood drained from Sophie's face as his words sank in. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Ethan watched as her confidence crumbled before his eyes. You've been funneling money to Daniel for months, Ethan continued, his tone measured and controlled. Using our joint accounts to prop up his failing business. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Sophie's hands trembled slightly, but she tried to regain her composure. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest like a knife. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now, you think you can walk away from this with nothing more than a divorce? Sophie's eyes flashed with anger. I had no choice, Ethan. You've always controlled everything, our lives, our money. I needed something for myself. Ethan shook his head slowly. This isn't about control. It's about trust. And you threw that away the moment you let him into our lives. Sophie's shoulders slumped, the weight of her choices finally crashing down on her. What are you going to do? Ethan's eyes darkened, his voice cold and deliberate. You're not getting anything from me. Not the house. Not the money. Nothing. And as for Daniel, his business is already crumbling. By the time I'm done, he'll have nothing left, either. Sophie stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes. You did this? Ethan nodded slowly. I told you, Sophie. I know everything. I've been one step ahead of you both this entire time. Sophie's breath hitched, and for the first time, Ethan saw real fear in her eyes. She had underestimated him, thought she could deceive him without consequence. But now, she was realizing the full extent of her mistake. You've destroyed everything, she whispered, her voice shaking. Why? Ethan's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. You destroyed it, Sophie. The moment you chose him over us. Sophie's face crumpled as the truth finally hit her. The life she had imagined with Daniel was over, unraveling before her eyes. Ethan had not only taken control of their finances but had also dismantled Daniel's world, piece by piece, leaving nothing but ruins in its place. She turned away, tears slipping down her face, but Ethan didn't move to comfort her. This was the reality she had created, and now she had to live with it. Sophie's voice was barely audible as she spoke again. I loved you, Ethan. Once. Ethan's expression hardened. But not enough. With those final words, Sophie walked out the door, leaving Ethan alone once again. The house was silent, the air heavy with the aftermath of their confrontation. Ethan stood there, staring at the door for a long time after she left, the cold realization settling in. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. He had destroyed Daniel, shattered Sophie's world, and protected himself from further betrayal. But in the end, the one thing he couldn't control was the emptiness that remained. Ethan watched as the door clicked shut behind Sophie, the sound echoing through the empty house. The cold silence that followed filled the room, making the space feel larger, emptier than it ever had before. For a long moment, Ethan stood perfectly still, his mind processing the events that had just unfolded. Sophie was gone, and with her, the last remnants of the life they had built together. But instead of relief or satisfaction, all he felt was a deep, numbing emptiness. The first part of his plan had gone exactly as he had envisioned. Daniel's business was crumbling, piece by piece. Every client Ethan had sabotaged, every whispered piece of information that had sown doubt, had done its work. Daniel's reputation was in tatters, his financial standing hanging by a thread. Sophie had no idea that the very man she had aligned herself with was on the brink of losing everything. Ethan had ensured that Daniel would fall, and fall hard, leaving Sophie with nothing to cling to. It was the kind of slow, methodical revenge Ethan had always excelled at, precise, calculated, devastating. But now that it was done, now that Sophie had walked out the door, he wasn't sure what came next. He had been so focused on executing his plan, on destroying Daniel and ensuring that Sophie suffered for her betrayal, that he hadn't thought about what would happen afterward. The house felt eerily quiet, as though the confrontation had drained all the life from it. Ethan found himself sitting down in the living room, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He had won, hadn't he? Daniel was finished, Sophie was ruined, and yet... A few days passed, and the fallout of Ethan's actions became increasingly apparent. Daniel's business, once struggling, had now collapsed entirely. Ethan heard whispers from colleagues in the industry, how Daniel's clients had pulled their contracts, how his investors had withdrawn support, and how his company had declared bankruptcy. It was all over for him, and Ethan took a grim satisfaction in knowing that he had orchestrated every step of Daniel's downfall. But as Daniel's business unraveled, so did Sophie. She had tried to reach out to Ethan several times after their final confrontation, but he ignored her calls, her messages. She had nothing left now, no money, no partner to support her, no future with Daniel. Every avenue she might have turned to had been systematically cut off by Ethan's careful planning. He had taken control of their joint finances, moving assets into accounts she couldn't touch, ensuring that she was left with nothing but regret. At first, Sophie had held on to some semblance of defiance, thinking she could still find a way out, a way forward with Daniel. But as the days passed and the full scope of their situation became clear, her spirit began to break. She had placed all her faith in a man who had lied to her, manipulated her just as she had tried to manipulate Ethan. Now, with Daniel's business gone, she had nowhere to turn, and the reality of her choices was crashing down on her. Ethan observed all of this from a distance, never intervening, never offering her any form of solace. He had watched her grow increasingly desperate, her calls to him becoming more frequent, more pleading. She was unraveling, just as Daniel had, and Ethan had no intention of stopping it. This was her punishment, her penance for the lies, for the betrayal. One afternoon, as he was leaving the office, Ethan ran into an old colleague who mentioned Daniel's fate in passing. "Heard about Daniel?" the man asked casually. "Poor guy's business went under fast. Nobody's sure what happened, but he's done for." Ethan merely nodded, keeping his face neutral. "Yes, I've heard. It's unfortunate," he replied, though inside, he felt no pity. Daniel had reaped what he'd sown, and Ethan had been the architect of his destruction. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie's attempts to contact Ethan dwindled. She stopped calling, stopped sending messages, and Ethan assumed she had finally accepted the truth, that she had lost everything, and there was no coming back from it. He hadn't heard from Daniel, nor did he expect to. The man had been thoroughly dismantled, left with nothing but the ruins of his failed business and a shattered reputation. Ethan's life, on the surface, returned to normal. He went to work, continued his projects, and kept up the appearance of a man who had it all together. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone at home, he couldn't escape the gnawing sense of isolation that had settled in. He had succeeded in his revenge, there was no denying that. He had destroyed those who had wronged him, brought them to their knees. But now, standing in the aftermath, he was left with nothing but the silence of an empty house. The anger that had fueled him for so long was gone, leaving behind a hollow space where his marriage had once been. Ethan had been so focused on getting even, on punishing Sophie and Daniel, that he hadn't considered what would come after. He had severed the ties to his past, but in doing so, he had also severed any sense of connection, any chance of moving forward. He had won the battle, but lost everything else in the process. One evening, a few weeks after Sophie had walked out of his life for good, Ethan sat in the living room, the same spot where he had confronted her. The house was dark, quiet, just as it had been that night. He glanced around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings that now felt foreign to him. Every piece of furniture, every detail of the house, had been part of the life he had built with Sophie. And now, with her gone, it all felt meaningless. Ethan had always prided himself on control, on his ability to shape the world around him to his liking. But no amount of control could change the fact that he was alone. Sophie was gone, and so was the life they had shared. And while he had destroyed Daniel, the man had taken something from Ethan, too, his sense of purpose, of connection. As the days continued to pass, Ethan found himself questioning everything. The revenge he had sought had been so precise, so thorough, but it hadn't brought him the satisfaction he had expected. Instead, it had left him feeling empty, as though he had lost more than he had gained. He had proven his point, had shown Sophie and Daniel the consequences of betrayal, but at what cost? Sitting in the darkness of his home, Ethan realized that revenge hadn't brought him the closure he had hoped for. It had only deepened the void that had already existed in his life. Sophie's betrayal had torn their marriage apart, but his own actions had ensured that there was no way to rebuild, no way to move on. The house was silent, as it always was now. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had thought revenge would give him peace, but it had only left him with a profound sense of isolation. Ethan sat alone in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the stark emptiness that had come to define his existence. The once meticulous architect, known for his control and precision, now found himself in a house that felt more like a hollow shell. He had gotten everything he wanted. Sophie and Daniel were both ruined, left in the wreckage of their own deceit. But instead of the satisfaction he had anticipated, Ethan was left with an overwhelming sense of isolation, the realization settling in that revenge had not brought him the peace he had sought. The days following Sophie's departure stretched on in an almost surreal way. Ethan went through the motions of his daily life, his routines mechanical and devoid of meaning. The phone calls from Sophie had stopped, and any communication with her had ceased altogether. She was gone, fully and irrevocably. In the end, she had nothing left, no money, no future with Daniel, no place in Ethan's life. He had ensured that her betrayal would be met with complete and total devastation. As for Daniel, his business had collapsed, the fallout from Ethan's careful sabotage leaving him with nothing but a tarnished reputation and a trail of debt. Ethan had watched it all unfold from a distance, keeping tabs on the financial ruin he had orchestrated. Daniel had tried to salvage what little was left of his company, but it was too late. The clients Ethan had quietly warned, the investors he had subtly undermined, it had all come together perfectly, resulting in Daniel's swift and inevitable downfall. Yet, despite it all, the victory felt hollow. Ethan had planned everything meticulously, leaving no stone unturned in his quest to destroy the man who had stolen his wife and the woman who had betrayed him. He had executed his revenge with the same precision that had made him successful in his career, and yet, the satisfaction he had envisioned never came. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself reflecting more and more on what had happened. He had spent so much time focusing on his anger, his need for retribution, that he hadn't anticipated the consequences of his actions, on himself. He had won, but in doing so, he had isolated himself from the world, cut off from any chance of moving forward. The house, once filled with life, now echoed with silence. Every corner reminded him of the life he had shared with Sophie, a life that had been built on trust and companionship, now reduced to rubble. Ethan couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face during their final confrontation, the look of shock and devastation when she realized the extent of what he had done. In that moment, she had seen the full weight of her choices, and Ethan had taken a grim satisfaction in watching her world collapse. But now, in the stillness of the aftermath, he wondered if it had been worth it. He had torn her down, just as she had torn him apart, but in the end, they were both left with nothing. One evening, as Ethan sat in the living room, his mind wandered back to the years he and Sophie had spent together. They hadn't always been like this. Once, there had been love, real love, between them. He could still remember the early days of their relationship, when they would stay up late talking about their dreams, their future, the life they wanted to build together. Sophie had been the one person who had made him feel alive, who had brought joy and spontaneity into his otherwise structured world. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The distance between them had grown, imperceptibly at first, until it was too wide to bridge. Ethan stood up from his chair and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance, but they seemed far away, disconnected from the life he now led. His reflection stared back at him, and for the first time, Ethan truly saw the man he had become, cold, calculating, and alone. He had spent so much time focusing on what Sophie and Daniel had done to him that he hadn't considered what he had done to himself in the process. He thought about Sophie, wherever she was now, and wondered if she had found any kind of peace. He doubted it. He had made sure that her world had been completely upended. But the question that gnawed at him now was whether destroying her had truly given him anything. The revenge that had once seemed so necessary, so justified, now felt like an empty pursuit. In trying to punish her, Ethan had also cut himself off from any chance at happiness. The days continued to pass, and with each one, Ethan found it harder to ignore the growing sense of regret. He had lost more than just Sophie, he had lost himself in the process. The control he had once prided himself on now felt like a prison, keeping him locked in a life that no longer had any meaning. The house, once a symbol of his success and stability, now felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of a life that no longer existed. One afternoon, Ethan received an unexpected call. It was from a mutual acquaintance, someone who had known both him and Sophie for years. The conversation was brief, but the news left Ethan standing in stunned silence. Sophie had left the city. She had moved away, cutting ties with the life she had once known, leaving everything behind. It wasn't a surprise, really, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel final. Sophie was gone, not just from his life, but from the place they had called home. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something other than anger or resentment. It was a deep, aching sense of loss. He had thought that destroying Sophie and Daniel would make him feel whole again, but instead, it had left him more broken than before. He had achieved his goal, but in the process, he had lost everything that had once mattered. Ethan walked through the empty house, his footsteps echoing off the walls. He paused in the doorway of what had once been their bedroom, the room where he and Sophie had shared so many moments, both good and bad. Now, it was just a room, devoid of life or meaning. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty bed, before finally turning away. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan began to let go of the anger that had driven him for so long. He had spent too much time focused on revenge, on punishing those who had hurt him, and in doing so, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Sophie was gone, Daniel was ruined, and Ethan was left with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. The house, once so carefully designed to reflect his sense of order and control, now felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. And as he stood in the silence, Ethan realized that control had never been the answer. He had sought it in every aspect of his life, but in the end, it had only left him alone. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to feel the weight of his decisions. He had spent so much time trying to hold everything together, but now, as he stood in the ruins of his life, Ethan knew that the only way forward was to let go. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.